was Sultan Abdul Hamid II?
There's two things here that we need to understand about power. One is the perception of power, and then two is the reality of power.
I understand that Sultan Abdul Hamid was famous and skilled at playing European powers against each other.
It was a fantastic thinker, a wonderful poet. In the Ottoman Empire, each sultan had to have some ability to be able to do some sort of handiwork.
In a very popular sense, his stance towards Zionism is often cited as one of his greatest achievements.
Because it shows a particular level of steadfastness and stoicism. The empire didn't collapse on his watch. It collapsed on the watch of the Young Turks. And that's a very really interesting conversation we should be having today, perhaps.
To help us unpack this complex figure, I'm joined by Dr Yakoob Ahmed, a historian of the late Ottoman period, whose work has brought fresh insight into the ideologies that shaped the final century of the Ottoman Caliphate. Dr Yakoob Ahmed, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me back in The Thinking Muslim. I just want to make this very clear. I'm not coming back to anyone else's podcast.
Jazakallah khair. So the last time we spoke, which was many months ago.
That's right.
You said you were hanging up your podcast hat for a while.
Yeah.
So alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair. You've been very generous in returning to our podcast.
I appreciate that.
So today we're going to talk about Sultan Abdul Hamid II,
yeah,
who was the Sultan between 1876 and 1909. So he was the ruler of the Muslim world, effectively, the Caliph, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the man in charge of vast terrains of the Muslim world. Of course, some would regard him to be the last great Ottoman Sultan as well, which maybe we can talk about, right? So Sultan Abdul Hamid II was this extraordinary character, but also, in some respects, many historians have suggested that he was quite a dark character, and there are some sides to him which were very authoritarian. So we're going to explore a lot of that today. But I suppose the starting point to this discussion is why. Like, why is it that there is an interest in Sultan Abdul Hamid II today amongst Muslims, amongst non-Muslims? What is it about Sultan Abdul Hamid II that makes him such an interesting Sultan to study?
Before I tell you why I think it's the case, you know what I'm going to do here, but why is he interesting to you? You're a Muslim.
Yeah, this always happens at the beginning of our podcast. See, I think that in a sense, he resonates with some of our insecurities today, whether that's Palestine, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, I'm sure we'll explore it, was resolute on Palestine and did not want to hand it over or sell it to the Zionists, regardless of economic problems. He presided over a terrain, an empire, a sultanate, which had its own fair share of problems.
Right.
You had outsiders, foreigners who were chipping away at the Islamic Empire. And in a world where I suppose we're looking out for historical precedents, but also historical figures that can inspire us, he does come across as someone who one should seek inspiration from.
Yeah, it's interesting because this is a question I'm trying to grasp myself in regards to the Muslim interest here. And I think I've mentioned this to you before. I think there is something in the way that Muslims write their history, which is based around the great man, but in particular, good leadership.
Right.
And it starts with the Seerah of Rasul Sallam, right? So we have the way that the Seerah is written in regards to documenting Rasul Sallam's life. It's not just a type of biography. It's a life journey and story, in the sense that we are seeing one aspect of what we are seeing is what it means to be a leader, and not just a political leader, a leader of the household, an educational leader, a spiritual leader, a religious leader, and so forth. It's all encapsulated in this one person who is a prophet, Rasul Sallam, chosen by Allah Ta'ala.
Yes.
And that culture of writing throughout Islamic history has been very strong.
Yeah.
And so you'll see that Muslims generally write about particular figures who are not necessarily Khalifa all the time. So you'll have someone like, Abu Hanifa, or you'll have Salahuddin Ayyubi, or you'll have, Nuruddin Zengi. You'll have people who are fighters, people who are scholars, people who are saigs and rulers of religious orders, and the people who are Khalifa as well. And there is something that Muslims are looking to say that resonates with our sort of like civilizational outlook about how we see ourselves in the world. So we have a particular expectation. And I think that resonates today more so because today we may argue that while we have clear cultures of rulership, we are lacking leadership. And that's felt quite strong. So Abdul Hamid II then resonates in one way because the question of Khilafah comes around quite often. And then as a Khalifa, the idea is here was one that represented a particular leadership style that that if we had that back, perhaps the Muslim situation would be different. So if we were to analyze that and to the granular level, I think that's what we're looking for as Muslims, which is that this absence of a collective culture of leadership representation in all facets of our life, by the way. And the current Muslim condition then, as you mentioned, goes back into a historical past to see when did that come about next. And Abdul Hamid himself is a quite diverse figure regarding the way that historians have written about him. But most Muslims, not all, there are those who see him in a different light, but most Muslims would resonate with the fact that he is considered, at least, as the last true great Caliph of the Ottoman Empire. And so what it's telling us is it's an issue of leadership, it's an issue of his reign, and it's an issue of what is Khilafah. I guess that's why we are drawn towards it.
Around the world, more than 250 million children are out of school due to poverty, displacement, and war. That's 250 million dreams deferred, 250 million futures at risk. In places such as Afghanistan, Gaza, Ghana, Kenya, Somalia, Pakistan, and beyond, students dream of attending school to better their futures and break the cycle of poverty. Baitulmaal is continuing to work in these countries to help change this reality, from opening schools in Gaza to supporting education programs for orphans in Ghana. Baitulmaal is helping children reclaim their right to learn. By sponsoring an education kit, you can help a child achieve their dreams. These kits include stationery, textbooks, uniforms, backpacks, and most importantly, hope for a better tomorrow. Turn your compassion into hope.
Right, so tell me about the basics, his background, who he was, how, what was his learning prior to becoming the Sultan.
Abdul Hamid II, subhanAllah, is an exceptional thinker, very astute, very methodical, and very aware politically of what's happening around the world. I mean, he wasn't supposed to be Khalifa. It was fortuitous events, if you want to call it that, or circumstance, if we call it that. So his uncle, Sultan Abdul Aziz, is removed from power by a particular military coup, and then is found dead either by murder or suicide, depending on what type of historian you are in regards to that. His brother Murad comes into power and was supposed to be the constitutional caliph, the first constitutional caliph, and loses his mind. So Abdul Hamid wasn't even in the picture. He was not even being trained to be the caliph in that context. But he was somebody who was exceptionally well versed in ulum ad-din, somebody who took interest in that. It was a fantastic thinker, a wonderful poet, a carpenter. And, so there is an idea in the Ottoman period that each sultan should be able to do something with their hands. And this is really interesting because I've read works of ulama at the Ottoman period. I think it was Al-Malal al-Hamdi Azar. I could be mistaken, but I think I remember reading from him that one of the gifts that Allah Ta'ala has given insan is hands. And there's a special unique connection with the hands and the soul, in which we do so much of our handiwork regarding the use of our hands. And the more people move away from the usage of their hands, and it's interesting in this current technological age where less people are doing things with their hands in terms of craft and so forth, and going into the technological field. In the Ottoman Empire, each sultan had to have some ability to be able to do some sort of handiwork. And Abdul Hamid was a wonderful craftsman. If you go to the Yildiz Mosque, which is his mosque, there are 2 columns made from wood on each side, which he had built himself and put into the masjid. There's a tekke just further down, 100 meters down, called Ertugrul Tekkesi, where the mihrab and the minbar are made from wood, and Abdul Hamid made them too. So he had a wide skill set. And I guess the idea is, and this is why it's important, because people look at him as a sultan. And we can also address that question of the sultan, because people look at the word sultan as being quite negative, because it sort of gives them the impression that it's a reflection of being an authoritarian. But the word sultan actually means somebody who's a representative. And it was Weber, the Marxist thinker, who had popularized the idea of sultanism when speaking about the Ottomans. And he had created an umbrella term to basically place the Ottomans in what he called Oriental despotism.
Yeah.
So everybody who was non-Western was considered, their political practices and strategies and governmental styles were all one of the same, which was these authoritarian like despots, right? And Abdul Hamid fell under that. But there were a lot of checks and balances within the Ottoman structure. And the Ottomans were very careful about, especially in the 19th century, of the type of leader that would represent their interests. And Abdul Hamid, whether it was, because of Allah Ta'ala, of course it was from Allah Ta'ala, but whether it was luck in the sense that, he just happened to be in the right place at the right time, or whether the Ottomans had created a culture where multiple sultans could lead, gets him in that position, and he is exceptional. And just one last point, but he's part of a governmental structure, right? And very few people talk about the Ottoman government. So he's part of an elite band of people who we call the Ulu Amr, who help and support him to facilitate this governmental style, for sure.
Right, okay. So he wasn't alone in his leadership. Rather, he had a structure around him.
He had a group of... So because he's been around for 30 years, you could say there are like 2 to 3 phases in which Abdul Hamid's political sort of like policies are practiced. In the earlier part, where he's trying to find his feet, concerned about the different types of contestant elites, he keeps himself close to a small-knit group of people. In the second part of it, where a new generation has emerged and he's consolidated his reign a lot more, he's surrounded by a lot more of these loyalists. And then the latter part of his reign, there are even those who are close to him, who are part of a particular educational background, who are not satisfied with the direction the empire has taken, and so they are more challenging to that. So, and that shows then that he's balancing that internal power structure that exists within the Ottoman Empire. It's not, as the point I was making, a simple case of authoritarianism, right, in that sense.
So you talked about in the answer to the first question that he comes along after one of his predecessors is overthrown by a coup.
Yeah.
So tell us about it. What were the demands of those who overthrew his brother, and how did they and what do they expect from Sultan Abdul Hamid? Because of course, Western commentators would suggest that the expectation was that he was going to be a liberal reformer, whatever that means in the context of that time, but he was going to be a liberal reformer, and they were quite disillusioned that he didn't turn out to be that reformer. So take me through the demands of those, and who were they?
I mean, he was a reformer. I think one of the things that gets taken out of the equation is that tradition has a transformative ability, the idea that tradition is always static. So the whole period of the 19th century is a period of reformation. So if you look at the emergence of the Wahhabi movement, technically it's a movement of reformation. The emergence of the sort of like reformist Salafist movement that emerges in Bilad al-Sham and Iraq and Egypt. Once again, that's another type of reformist movement in that sense. So there is reformism that's taking place across the Muslim world in that sense. The idea of liberal reformism in the way that we understand it today, I don't think anyone would have understood it in that way at that time. Let me break it down like this. There was two different types of camps. A camp that believed that authority was invested in the Khalifa, in the person himself.
Yeah.
And then there was a camp that believed in investing the authority in the Khilafah as a system. And the difference is that the first one, where is investing authority in the Khalifa, means the buck stops with a particular individual. That individual can be held to account. And that individual, so long as they are upright, pious, and ethical in accordance with Islam, then we should obey that person to the best of their ability. Whereas the technocrats within the governmental structure were saying, we shouldn't leave it to that type of chance in the type of configuration we have, which is a sultanic model. So we should create a system in which we don't have that level of dependency on the Caliph himself, but have a constitution which kind of creates the norms of what the government ought to be. So they wanted a parliamentary system. And the parliamentary system was designed, by and large, not simply as a shura council, but, for example, matters to do with taxation. It shouldn't be left to the Caliph alone to make those decisions. That the parliament as a collective could come to the conclusion that these are the better policies for taxation, then send it to the Caliph, him looking over it, and then he has the power to veto or not. So what they wanted was to make sure that the Caliph didn't have absolute authority to the point that he could take you to war and bring the destruction of the empire, or he could economically bankrupt the empire. So they wanted to create a more technical state. So their idea was to have a constitution which was in conformity with the Sharia.
Right.
And then the constitutional government, which the Caliph was a participant of, including the parliamentarians and the Ulu Amr, and then the Caliph in that particular type of matrix, because it's not a straight hierarchy, because they still have the capacity. So, for example, Abdul Hamid could still pick who could be in the group of Ulu Amr and so forth, but you don't not have total choice.
Right.
But then there was another group who didn't like that idea. So when Abdul Hamid does come in, making the demands that I will adhere to the constitutional governance, because maybe that is the way to go forward now that we are modernizing as an empire.
Yeah.
Feels that it's not just him, but his close aides like Jevdet Pasha, for example. They think, you know what, this is not working. We've tried it, but this is a bit of a mess. And because they had got into war with Russia at the time and had heavy losses, and the parliament wasn't capable of bringing out the type of solutions that Abdul Hamid was satisfied with. So he said, you know what, let's just scrap this for now and we'll go again another time. In doing so, Mamdouh Pasha, who was of the belief that a good, stoic, strong, religious sultan is the way to go forward. The idea that we have, rather than placing emphasis on a system, that fundamentally the culture in Islam is that it still holds individuals to account. And that's a very interesting conversation we should be having today, perhaps. Because even today in our discourse, like you'll have some commentators who will hold Erdogan to account, or MBS to account, or particular Muslim leaders to account, because there is still a notion that the leader, to some degree, has a particular level of agency. And then if you read the works of Hallaq or Tal Asad or so forth, they will start talking to you about the system, the structure, and that you remove one person, but because the structure is the same, another one will replace them in the same manner. And I think what's needed here, perhaps, and this is where the Ottomans might be helpful in Abdul Hamid, is how do we find a balance here? Well, on the one hand, we can have a particular, or we can cultivate a particular sophisticated political structure, on the one hand, that is technocratic and has the means of checks and balances. Yeah. But at the same time, it's conducive to our culture of that there is an accountability of the person in charge, not only in the eyes of the Ummah, but also in the eyes of Allah Ta'ala. And so that was the contestation here.
Right, okay. But that contestation led to the deposition of one caliph. So that's
yeah, absolutely.
Right, okay. So who were the people? Who were the ones behind?
So like Midhat Pasha, the Grand Vizier, was one of them. Okay. Sheikh al-Islam Hayrullah Effendi was another.
So this was not some sort of Western modernist
no, absolutely.
movement. Okay.
But the thing is so in the Western discourse, the argument is that these people were influenced by the West.
Right.
But if you look in more detail, I guess what they're reflecting is how do you modernize an empire and still hold it accountable to your own ethics and values.
Right.
And there's a debate that's been had in Ottoman studies about the notion of Ottoman modernity. So Ottoman modernity is a concept that's been used prior, which is that it's just a reflection of a imitation of the West, insecurity by the Ottomans replicating Western models and so forth. But if you read the works of maybe like today, Taha Abdul Rahman and so forth, the Muslim philosopher from Morocco, you start to see that what he's making the case is that an Islamic modernity can be an alternative modernity. The idea that the world keeps moving forward, the idea that Muslims are just going to remain static doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
The Ottomans are also moving forward, and they're trying to negotiate with the changing role regarding colonialism, industrialization, and so forth. But how do you make that fit within an Islamic remit?
Right.
So contemporary constitutionalism is an interesting concept because you know, as somebody who does political science, that it's considered as a Western concept. And there are Ottoman historians like Hussein Yilmaz, for example, who make the argument that the Ottomans had traditions of constitutional checks and balances. And that Ottoman constitutionalism, in some ways, is just a reflection of a contemporary reflection of those sort of practices, which is having checks and balances.
Right.
Today, if you were to ask Muslims politically, how do they feel about constitutional theory, it would be an interesting conversation, because what makes the Ottomans interesting, perhaps, is that it's a constitutional khilafah. We don't have that type of... I don't think we've ever seen that, apart from in the case of the Ottomans, because the only khilafah who did that. We do have constitutions in Afghanistan. We had constitutions in other parts of the state of Johor Bahru, which is the southern Malaysian state, that looked at the Ottomans and then said, how could we reform our states in accordance with something that fits within the Islamic model? So the tensions are, and this is what's interesting, I guess, is that when you're trying to reform and change and discursively transform, the assumption is that there's not going to be moments of tensions and violence, that these are smooth transitions. That's not always the case, especially at the high end of political power. In the case of the Sultanate, because the concern that Abdul Hamid and his followers had was that this could really relegate the office of the Sultanate to being something secondary and elevating the office of the parliament.
Right.
And so his concern was, how can we keep that in check? Whereas the parliamentarians were making the argument that we have no interest of overstepping our prerogatives regarding the Sultan, but this is in the interest of the empire, and that a more efficient system, a more centralized system, now that we've got decentralization, means we need to try something different.
Now, Abbott, we're talking about late 19th century. There is a challenge that the Ottoman Caliphate has from outside.
Absolutely.
And this challenge comes in the form of a military challenge from European powers who are in some respects militarily superior, if that's the right word to use. But also there are economic challenges that the empire faces. Just talk me through some of the challenges Sultan Abdul Hamid had to deal with when he came to office. So
before I go to that, I wanted to talk about something which is of interest to me about declining empires, perhaps.
Yes.
Because the question is predicated on this notion of how Muslims feel about the decline of the Ottoman Empire. It's something that I have to deal with a lot. And what you see in the Ottoman case is there are discussions within the circles of the Ottoman elites about whether the empire is in a state of decline or not. And what you see in the works of Muslim thinkers at the time is quite interesting, because there's a recognition that there's two types of civilizational decline. One is a material decline, and one is a moral decline. The material decline is that there could be moments in a civilization or nations or states' history in which they, at some given point, fell behind technologically in regards to another empire. And that could be for various reasons. And so as a result of that, while that is unacceptable, because there's an expectation that Muslims ought to be competent, but it can happen because that's just the nature of human beings. You can't, maintaining that continuum is difficult. Ask supporters of Manchester City, right? You win the league 4 years in a row and then sudden collapse, right? So then what you see is there's a concern. That's one. The second concern, which the ulama had primarily, was about the moral decline. The idea that when you go down a particular moral decline, even if you are materially superior, if your decadence is so extreme that you can't reverse that back, right? And so why is this important? Because the material decline is understood that you lost your dunya, you lost your worldly gains.
Yeah.
But you'd like to believe, at least in terms of your akhirah, the end of the world, you tried your best and it didn't work out. But if you morally decline, like let's just look at Western civilization and Israelis today, you don't only lose your dunya, the world, you lose your akhirah, you lose both. And so Ottoman thinkers were really concerned when diagnosing their reality that is this a material decline or is this a moral decline? Right. And they are having these debates amongst themselves. So the reformist Salafist movement in particular made the argument that this is a material decline. There's a scientific loss that's taking place. Europe has scientifically excelled ahead of us. And then you've got the Naqshbandi movement who are saying, no, we just need to reset the morality in people, that people are not doing the basics right and so on. Mm. In the end, the empire collapses. Now, why is this important? Because it tells you the sort of like thought process that the Ottomans are in regards to their reformation and how they see themselves. Because they do consider themselves as an alternative civilization to the world that they're in. Yeah. They see themselves, they do not see themselves as colonizing powers. You see Walter Mignolo, for example, who's a decolonial thinker. He says, the problem that Western writers have had regarding the Ottomans is the Ottomans were not colonized, nor were they colonizers, and they were part of the Western bloc. And the Western world didn't know where to place them. Mm. On the one hand, they didn't want to place them amongst themselves because they were primarily different because they were Muslim. Yeah. But at the same time, they couldn't lump them with the rest of the Muslim world because they hadn't been colonized and they were an existing power. And this is where the Ottomans are interesting, which is until the end, they are trying to hold that position. And Abdul Hamid's policies now go into this question, which some people say, once again, the long-winded answer. Mm. But he tried to address these two matters. The first one was to find a balance on the one hand of material success, but not to the point that you lose your ethics and moral values. Right. To what degree can we materially compete with the West, but not to the point that we are subjugating our peoples to a particular form of harm where we dehumanize them in a way that they are no longer human. And so that was the challenge he had. So one of the major strategies he used was education, that he tried to create. The challenge he had was the madrasa system, what to do with it. We are now in a world where there is an expectation that among some Muslim thinkers that the madrasa system, which is the Muslim religious educational system, cannot cater for every subject area. It's just not possible. So there was one group of thinkers who said, why don't we extend the madrasa system out, add other subjects to it, and make this a like exceptional educational system. Another group of people said, well, why don't we separate them out? Why don't we leave the madrasa alone purely for ulum ad-din in those subject areas? And yet on the other hand, have a new educational system where it's separate, but we still give them the basic Islamic training of what it means to be a good Muslim. What's interesting here, however, is Abdul Hamid, by doing that, this is what many people sometimes miss, is he created an education system where he took the agency away from the family and gave the agency to the state, in the sense that now he's deciding what people are learning and what they're not learning, right, in that sense, and what type of education they ought to have. And prior to that, there was a particular level of decentralization in regards to learning and knowledge production. But those are one of the things he did. But he opened up many schools, universities, and invested heavily on infrastructure. And he invested heavily on science and technology because he did believe that there was a Islamic way of doing this.
Now, I understand that, again, Western commentators would suggest that, or historians would suggest that he was the first sultan to overtly use the term Caliph, Khalifa, and that reflected his pan-Islamism, this idea that he was the Caliph over all of the Muslim world, or large parts of the Muslim world, rather than just a particular group within the Muslim world. How much do you buy into that idea of being the first official Caliph?
Yeah, no, I don't buy into it at all. First, because there is an assumption that previous Ottoman sultans didn't consider themselves caliphs, which is just not true.
Right.
You see that in the case of Genç Osman in the 17th century, Sultan Ahmed. So the wonderful blue Sultan Ahmed Mosque, Sultan Ahmed considered himself caliph. What happens is, we call it the long 19th century in historical writing, right? I think it was Hobsbawm who used the word long 19th century. I could be wrong. Somebody can correct me in the comments. They always do that anyway. And the long 19th century is this idea that from the end of the 18th century up until 1924, it tries to encapsulate all of it. So in 1774, the Ottomans in the Crimea are defeated by the Russians, and they sign a treaty called the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca, in which the terms are considered unfavorable in the sense that the Russians are given conditions to more or less annex the Crimea, move around in the Black Sea, and have some level of agency over Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottomans, when you look at the documentation from the Ottoman side, the paperwork looks a little bit different. And I think here is interesting in terms of how the Ottomans saw themselves in these terms, and how the Russians saw these terms are unique. But that's another conversation. But so in 1774, the Russians also signed a document recognizing as the Ottomans as the global Caliphate, which was unprecedented. And never before had a power recognize the Ottomans as a Caliphate. And the Russians had did that in writing. And in doing so, the idea, or the hope was for the Ottomans at least, because the Crimea was the first loss of Muslim territory.
Yeah.
Today, when we look at the Crimea, we're looking at the war between Ukraine and Russia. And it's devoid of the Muslim imagination, and that was a Muslim territory at one point in the Ottoman Empire. And so by the Russians recognizing the Ottomans were a global caliphate, it actually resonated with the Ottomans, because the hope was that in the future, because what the Ottomans could also do is choose the chief mufti from Istanbul for the Crimea. And the caliph's name is still said in Jummah Khutbah and so forth, that they would go back one day and the Muslims, the structure would still be there. They never went back. It never happened. But what it did do going forward, when we see the case of Selim III, Mahmud II, Abdul Majid I, and even Abdulaziz, is the notion of the Ottomans being a global caliphate and having some level of spiritual agency over Muslims around the world became important. And they actually execute. Abdul Hamid, where he is unique, is he executed policies regarding this type of rhetoric for Muslims in the Asian subcontinent, parts of Russia, Africa, North Africa, and so on. And so
these were lands which were not formally part of
they were not part of the Ottoman Empire. And it creates even a debate within the Ottoman domains about, is this the jurisdiction of the Khalifa? Because there's an expectation that if you're going to make such a claim, that when Muslims are suffering in other parts of the world, you need to do something about it. But I guess what Abdul Hamid was trying to do to some degree is to maintain the idea, or the maintenance of the idea of the Khilafah. Because at the same time, the British were already promoting ideas that the Ottomans were illegitimate as a caliphate. And the Wahhabis, during the reign of Sultan Selim III and Mahmud II, had rejected the Ottomans as a caliphate because they didn't consider them as Muslims. And then there were certain reformist Salafist thinkers who, while not outwardly and aggressively critiquing the Ottomans, but did give some credence to the idea that the Khalifa has to be from the Quraysh, and that Abdul Hamid and the Ottomans are not that. So the concern Abdul Hamid has now is, one, to maintain the integrity of the empire, but two, these internal voices, these multiple voices. And I'm not saying, that these peoples and actors are in collusion, but collectively they create a particular type of pressure which Abdul Hamid recognizes. And so he then emphasizes even further on the supremacy of his caliphate and him being caliph, so that the Ottomans were not challenged. I mean, they even put it in the constitution. So in the constitution, it was written that the Ottomans are the only ones who can be caliph, and that Istanbul, and this is really interesting, that Istanbul should remain the capital of the caliphate until the end of time. And the reason being, and I think a lot of people maybe don't look at these things, and I've only come to this type of exposure because I'm a historian. For the Ottomans, there are particular ideas, Quranic ideas and Hadith ideas that matter to them. The notion of Bilad al-Sham, which includes Bait al-Maqdis. They saw that as one type of hemisphere, one type of ecosystem. Misr, Egypt, the Hijaz, including Yemen, Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, and Bilad al-Rum. And they believed from Islamic evidences that these areas which are mentioned in Islam historically continuously have a particular geographical and religious importance. And so because Fatih was considered as the Sultan who conquered Constantinople, they considered that that was not only some sort of like great boon, but it was a sacred event. And so that was a boon given to them by Allah Ta'ala until the end of time. And so Istanbul, in a strange way, became part of the sacred imagination. And Abdul Hamid was the Caliph who was residing in Istanbul. So why is this interesting? Because it tells you a particular understanding of the Ottoman thinking of the historical Caliphate, which is that there is a particular geographical space which exists regarding their integrity. So Bait al-Maqdis was important. Makkah and Medina were important. They're not going anywhere. They're geographically located somewhere. And it's the job of the Khalifa to protect Aqidah, including these spaces. So it's really intriguing how they internalize these things. Today, people may reject that, but I'm just explaining to you how Ottoman ulama themselves, you see this in the works of, for example, Ziauddin Dagestani and Jevdet Pasha, and even Fuad Pasha, who was not very outwardly religious in this way. He was the Grand Vizier, but also making these types of claims.
So when we think about Sultan Abdul Hamid II, I think in a very popular sense, his stance towards Zionism is often cited as one of his greatest achievements. So for Zionists, the state is in economic turmoil, or at least it's in great amounts of debt. And the Zionist movement approach him. In return for Palestine, they would pay off the debts of the Ottoman Empire. And he very firmly rejects that proposal. Like how, at the time, how momentous was this conversation, and what lay behind, I suppose, his steadfastness when it comes to Palestine.
It's difficult to know how momentous it was at the time. I mean, to what degree were people privy to the political decisions that were being made in the palace? Right. It's difficult to know.
Sure.
I mean, this is not a slight on Abdul Hamid here. I think any Ottoman caliph would have rejected those positions. It's just unthinkable. In the Ottoman context, the idea of giving up, Palestine, Bait al-Maqdis to anyone, let alone the Zionists, would have been unimaginable, even the young Turks in that sense. But I think the point you made about the empire being in an economically difficult situation and Abdul Hamid being unwilling to compromise his values based on that is something which is interesting, because today, when we speak to Muslims of a particular inclination, they will make the case that out of necessity, particular decisions have to be made. And the idea is that if you didn't do that, then there will be a particular type of ruin. Now, Abdul Hamid may have calculated that, but also probably would have trusted his own instincts in terms of safeguarding the region and so on. Now, the empire collapses in World War I, so there's not much he can do there. But he wouldn't have given an inch to anyone of the empire, and that does say something. I think that narrative in of itself is important because it shows a particular level of steadfastness and stoicism in which a particular type of compromise is not going to be made. And I'm not saying Abdul Hamid didn't make compromises. He was running an empire. At times, political decisions forced him to do so. But on this case, it wasn't going to happen. And it tells us something about leadership again, right? And the expectation we have in regards to leadership about making the right decision. And then trusting Allah Ta'ala and then trusting the Ummah, perhaps.
So Yakoob, I'm trying to understand these challenges that he faced. Like, is Abdul Hamid II afraid or anxious that the empire may crumble, that the economic crisis his sultanate faces may bring the empire down, that foreign forces, foreign countries are conspiring to chip away at the peripheries of this empire. Are these the anxieties of Sultan Abdul Hamid II?
Absolutely. And it's not just his anxieties, it's the anxieties of many.
Right.
I mean, we spoke about Zionism. If you look at some of the works of like Ruhi al-Khalidi, okay, so I think Ruhi al-Khalidi is the grandfather of Rashid Khalidi. And so even in Rashid Khalidi's 100 years, right, he writes about this. So Ruhi is a Palestinian who goes to Istanbul, educated in Istanbul, comes back, understands the notion of constitutionalism and so forth, but is aware of the particular Zionist threat in a way that other people were not aware of. The feeling of Western encroachment and the collapse of empire was very real. And I think there's two things here that we need to understand about power. One is the perception of power, and then two is the reality of power. Most power projects a particular perception. It has to. And so sometimes we don't appreciate and understand that the way that you project that perception, like America today, as the all, conquering empire that can never be defeated, there has to be some level of skill required in the thinker to make the distinction between how much of this is projection of a perception, as a way, like in the case of the Mongol invasion, which is that if you move, we're going to kill you. So then you just maintain it. And there is a belief amongst certain Muslim thinkers that in the Muslim world, if they just free themselves from the shackles, because a lot of it is perception, then that things will be a little different. And then there is the reality on the ground itself, which is pointing to a particular direction. The loss of Egypt, parts of the Balkans, the Balkan question, the Eastern question, and so forth are very real. And so Abdul Hamid is concerned about that. Did they believe the empire would collapse? That's a difficult one, because when it does collapse, the shock is huge. So that means that to some degree, while the fear was always living rent-free in their heads, they still didn't come to the terms that was going to happen. I'll give you an example. If I said to you tomorrow, or today, let's put it out now, for all your viewers, I'm going to be quite blank, it's very possible that we may lose Masjid al-Aqsa. It's very possible. Is that perception or is that reality? What am I projecting here? And everyone's going to say, "This, what's he talking about?" Okay, but we're looking at a genocide right now. We're looking at a chipping away or something, and fundamentally, Muslims have not moved. That's the reality on the ground. For whatever reasons, in their various homes, for whatever, they haven't moved. So is this feeling and sentiment of mine, is this real or is this a perception? And then you'd say it's a bit of both. And tomorrow, that could be possible. And so in that sense, that is something that needs to be thought about. But let me give you another counter to that. The state of Israel won't stick around for another 10, 15 years, that it will collapse. Is that perception or is that reality? That's also possible. It's also possible. I mean, the level of aggression and violence that you ramp up to that point, it goes back to that point I made before about the moral decline of a particular civilization is irreversible. That now the decree of Allah Ta'ala has begun. The laws of nature cannot be changed. And so now it's just a particular matter of time. So what does that mean exactly? Now, going back to the question of Abdul Hamid, at the time, the Ottomans were thinking, because they were a power and they existed, of multiple permutations. Ottoman thinkers were continuously drawing up the possibilities. What if this happened? What if that happened? And so you read the projection of those fears based on reality and perception. And so it gives us a particular understanding. Now, because the empire collapsed in the end, those became self-fulfilling prophecies, perhaps. And so many historians make the case that this was inevitable in the way that...
I suppose what I'm asking is, there is that, we retrospectively maybe look back at those times and say that everyone was in doom and gloom, and there was this sort of crumbling empire. Things were the house was collapsing, and Sultan Abdul Hamid II comes along and tries to stabilize the house.
Steady the ship.
Right. Is that more than perception? Was that the reality of Ottoman society?
Not totally. No. Yes, amongst certain elites, because there are people who are half glass empty and half glass full. I mean, but let's look at the case of the British Empire, right? The Ottomans were looking at the British, and in one degree, the British are stretching their resources and so forth. But after the success of 1924, who would have thought that Britain in 47, 48 would have totally collapsed and combusted? In the space of 20 years, that empire, you have the creation of the State of Israel, independence of India and the partition of India and Pakistan, and so forth. Its empire crumbled, but it's written as sort of like, what the Brits have been good at is when they've written their history, they've written it about a residual decline in empire. And the small island exists even today, right? The Ottomans don't have that chance because the nation states emerge as a consequence of that. So it's not just the Ottomans who have this concern. There are multiple concerns about powerful blocs and thinkers, like in Russia, regarding the Bolshevik Revolution and so forth. It goes back to this question about the perception of power and how fragile is power. Maintaining authority continuously from generation to generation is not an easy task. It requires a particular level of skill and culture and tradition.
Right.
And so that fragility is always there. And I think the point here is interesting. Why? Let's look at the United States of America. What are we examining here?
Everyone's talking about decline. Yeah.
Right, they're talking about, the Americans are not. There is a segment in the right that's trying to revitalize the state and give it a rebirth and so forth. And one could argue that there is a recognition even in the United States. But by and large, you speak to most Americans and say, is your empire in decline? They will probably tell you no. So, but outside commentators are looking at this and how long will they maintain this? There are many commentators talking about the multipolar world, but others saying this may not be the case. I think in the Ottoman Empire, this is similar. What's unique about Abdul Hamid, he's in power for 30 years. And that opens the question about how long should one be in power? Because a lot of Ottoman achievements, ironically, have happened when sultans maintain long reigns.
Right.
Fatih, Suleiman, Abdul Hamid, Mahmud II. These long stretches where there is a continuity of political decision-making and a plan and so on. Now, today, some people will counter that and say that one shouldn't be in power for that long. But in the Islamic mindset, in those days, that was never part of the imagination. Right. If somebody was incompetent, they found ways of removing him from power.
Hijaz Railway.
Yeah.
There was this sort of attempt to connect the Muslim world with this sort of mega infrastructure project. What was the idea behind that?
The Hajj.
Right.
It is. This is well documented. Like sometimes thinkers and writers will say, really?
Yeah.
It was the Hajj. When you look at the way that the money was collected, there is a particular amount of money that comes from India, but the majority of the money came from the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. And why did the money come from the Ottoman Empire? And only from Muslims, by the way. It was only demanded from the Muslims because this was considered their sadaqah jariyah of building a railway for the people on Hajj to be able to fulfill their pilgrimage duties.
Right.
This is well documented. And the reason why everybody was allowed to contribute, irrespective, was now, I don't use this word often, this was the first ummatic effort. This is a proper ummatic effort, if we're going to use that terminology, right? Which is the ummah collectively invested in a project that was driven by the Khalifa globally around the world to create an infrastructure for the Hajj. Yes, it was also used during World War I for moving soldiers up and down, but that wasn't its primary use, And they were very careful in making sure that the Muslims were in, control. They took no loans, no debts, nothing. This was, and Abdul Hamid himself put in a lot of his own money. So this was a fantastic endeavor in that sense. And this is important because often when people are talking about the Ottoman Empire, they want to imagine that the Ottomans are just like everyone else. And when Muslim historians like me make the case they are a little different, the sort of like claim that's placed in my direction, well, you're just being romantic because you're Muslim. But actually, this is well documented by historians who've written about the Hijaz Railway. This is not just, me saying this. This is well known, and you can see that in the documentation.
Right, okay. I understand that Sultan Abdul Hamid was famous at and skilled at playing European powers against each other. to preserve the Ottoman terrains. Was he successful in his strategy? And could we argue that this was sort of a skilled diplomatic effort?
Absolutely.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Go through that with me, please.
I mean, one of the things that Abdul Hamid recognized was that the danger to the empire was coalition. So if we look at from the time of Selim III, we're looking at like 1808 onwards. Okay. The world of coalition, or political coalitions, start to become the new thing, right? And the Ottomans are struggling to create coalitions. Who do they make coalitions with? Because the Muslim world is colonized. So you're isolated in the possibilities of the types of coalitions you can make. Whereas the Western world, even though they were in competition, at times will construct particular forms of coalitions against one or the other. Yeah. And Abdul Hamid's major concern was that if, for example, Britain, Russia and France created a particular coalition against the Ottomans, then that would spell the end of the empire, right? And he wasn't wrong, because we saw that in World War I. So what he tried to do was continuously offset particular policies of interest, where something might be of interest to the French and he would pit them off against the British and so forth. And then this once again becomes interesting about his claim and call for Muslims around the world, because he has some level of agency regarding the Hajj for Muslims in India. He had the capability to apply pressure on the British in India as a way of making sure that the British don't put pressure on the Ottomans in Egypt and so on. And he exercised that. Now, some people today may disagree with that type of diplomacy, but that's what he was doing as a way of trying to put pressure on the Western powers and maintaining the integrity of his domains, right? Yes. And so the term you use, pan-Islamism, I think this, I want to address that, because in the Ottoman works, we see the works Ittihad al-Islam, which means Islamic unity. And the British constructed the term pan-Islamism, which was to try to make a distinction between Islam, the religion, and then the politics of Islam and its activism. And so they needed to give that a vocabulary. The Ottomans didn't have a distinction. They didn't see it in that way. So when they were calling for the Ummah to collectively move, it wasn't seen as a unique form of political activism. It was just something which was a given. It was just a unique environment because they had global reach. But for the British in particular, they needed to give it that type of name. And that name was pejorative, in fact. It was. And the reason why this is important is because you probably had guests on here who have countered the qualification of the vocabulary regarding Islamism.
Yes.
This is the extension of that. No other religion gets the word pan, by the way. You get Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism, and so forth. Islam is the only one that, you don't get Pan-Christianity. So Islam is the only one that got Pan-Islamism. Now, why is that? That's interesting, because it tells you that in the West, to some degree, they recognize that Islam is unique civilizationally. It has a particular type of political component that can galvanize people from around the world in a particular way. And this was happening not simply driven by Abdul Hamid II. This was reciprocal. And this is important because there is an assumption by some within even Ottoman studies that people of power instrumentalize Islam and the masses just follow, as if they have zero agency in understanding their deen. And the Muslim world is far more complex and layered than that. There were too many people that would have called you out if you tried to use Islam as a weapon in that way. And we would have seen those types of contestations. So often this was reciprocal. People recognized that, it's not just that the Ottoman Empire is under threat. What the Ottomans believed, and Abdul Hamid himself and the thinkers, is that Islam was under threat. Because as a civilizational bastion, that is an alternative to colonialism, that if it collapses, then the Muslim world as a whole is never going to be the same. And they were right.
You've mentioned this before, but let's explore authoritarianism. Because the criticism of Sultan Abdul Hamid II is that, he starts out as a reformer and as someone who wants to modernize the Ottoman state. And, you've qualified what we mean by modernization and what isn't modernization. He certainly wasn't westernizing the Ottoman state, but he's modernizing the state. And initially there are political reforms and, he continues the Tanzimat reforms and constitutionalism. But then But then the argument goes that he becomes more and more authoritarian and concentrates power at the center. And towards the end, even his ministers and those people around him whittle down to a very few choice individuals. How true is this, and how much can we attach the label of authoritarianism to Sultan Abdul Hamid?
It's an interesting question. I'll tell you why. Because there's a writer called Ahmed Midhat Effendi who writes a tract, calls it authoritarian constitutionalism.
Right.
Now, what's intriguing here is the question, how do we qualify authoritarianism in the way that the Ottomans or Abdul Hamid himself was practicing at the time? This is not me giving him a green light, by the way. I think there is, and I told you, Memduh Pasha to some degree believed that so long as the Sultan was pious, which he was, he was religious, which he was, that he believed in justice, which he did, that if he made mistakes, then that's on him.
Yeah.
But this type of system of entrusting the buck with an individual is a better system than to put it into a structure. And so my point is, I guess, and Abdul Hamid is not the only one here, because in the Tanzimat period, you see this from the Sublime Porte, which is the office of the Grand Vizier, that power or people in authority have a concern, just like a Desi father, that I don't want to hand this over to the kids because I've invested so much into this that if I give it to you, it'll fall apart. Now, some people will say, well, he was right, because when Abdul Hamid is removed from power, the empire starts to fall apart by the seams. So there is a belief in Abdul Hamid, at least, at a particular moment in the highest point of his reign, where I think he felt that he's the best decision maker in town. If people want to call that authoritarianism, that's fine. And I think there were people who were making this case. Near the end of his reign, where a new type of educated elites come into emergence, they believe that Abdul Hamid is surrounded by a kitchen cabinet which is not best suited for the needs of the empire.
Yeah.
And so now if you're surrounded by a group of people who are not given the right type of advice to the person at the top, something needs to change. And so that's why you start to see the emergence of the revolution, all right? Because we'll talk about this maybe later if you want, about the ulama and so forth, right? So istibdad, right, which is, istibdad can translate to authoritarian, despot, whatever. It depends on how you contextualize the severity in the way you write it. But the point I'm making is there was a group of people within the Ottoman structure who believed that it should remain in one person's hand. And then there was a group of people who believed it shouldn't. I have seen works, so for example, the daughter of Abdul Hamid II, and Tahsin Pasha. So when you watch the famous TV show, Tahsin Pasha's biography, both of them make the claim that near the end, Abdul Hamid was quite exhausted and was willing to give constitutionalism a go to some degree, because he recognized that he'd got to the end of his reign and, you know, that was that, and let's put it into a more technocratic state. Now, why am I mentioning all this? It's possible that he was an autocrat, which I think he was, but I'm not going to say he was insincere. I think he genuinely believed that what he was doing was right by the ummah, right? And that's a difficult one here. Today, will Muslims outright reject authoritarianism as a concept? Or will Muslims tolerate somebody to be in power for a prolonged period of time so long as he was upright and just? Do we put a time frame, like terms, on Muslim leadership? Or do we say no, that the pool of talented people is restricted, and to only have a unique, charismatic individual in power for 8 years is a problem. And I think in the Ottoman period, they didn't have that type of option. It was a sultanate, right? So so one would argue that every type of sultanate system is predicated on some level of authoritarianism in that sense. But like I said, there are some checks and balances there. But in a long-winded way, I think the simple answer is yes, because the nature of the structure is that.
Yeah.
But it's not the same type of authoritarianism, I guess, in what we're seeing today. And I think that distinction ought to be made.
It's not like a totalitarian
Absolutely,
state.
absolutely.
Right? That's it, the impression that we're given.
Absolutely.
Of Sultan
Because Abdul Hamid is
state.
nervous about being removed from power all the time.
Right.
There were multiple attempts of coups against him. He knew this. His uncle was removed in a coup. His brother was removed from power.
Yeah.
Multiple sultans were removed from power. There was some level of agency amongst the political elites, and Abdul Hamid was nervous about that.
Yeah.
Now, what he did to counter that, and this is where people will call him an authoritarian perhaps, is that he sent people out on exile, send them away from Istanbul so that they can't be politically problematic, right? And he did exercise those types of powers, and that was a heavy form of criticism against him by the ulama near the end. They said this was unacceptable.
There was an attempt by Sultan Abdul Hamid II to extend a hand of friendship to the Germans.
Yeah.
And maybe that's one of the reasons why the Ottomans ultimately joined the German effort in the First World War. Why was that relationship established with Germany?
I think they had very little choice, to be honest. Some of our viewers who are from the United Kingdom probably may not like to hear this, but this is quite true. The British were very disingenuous. Anyone reading their politics in the way that they operated at the time. And the Ottomans were concerned about that. What type of relationship could you establish with the British? Now, there was a belief amongst Abdul Hamid II, you see this in some of the paperwork. He believes that the British, to some degree, were people of their word.
Yeah.
But near the end, he started to get concerned that the British were making particular promises and then breaking them. A typical example is Sykes and Picot, right? So the Germans were a rising power. Abdul Hamid's belief would have been, by aligning with the Germans, to some degree, this rising power put a check and balance on British and French ambitions.
It's like aligning with the Chinese today or something.
Absolutely.
Right.
The Germans had no intentions on colonizing the empire.
Yeah.
And the Germans were perceived, just like today by the European powers in America, as a check and balance on Russian expansionism. And so for the Ottomans, not just Abdul Hamid, the Germans were a very unique rising power that they were willing to negotiate with. And the Germans saw the Ottomans as a gateway to the Muslim world, and they were interacting with the Ottomans in a very different manner.
Yeah.
And we talk about China, similar to the way the Chinese interact with the Muslim world, irrespective of what they're doing at home, but in regards to how they interact with Pakistan and so forth. The Germans were operating the Ottomans in the same way, in that sense. So the Ottomans saw them as the lesser of two evils, perhaps.
Right. You did say that he was removed from power in 1908, and it was the Young Turk Revolution that removed him from power. So explain that. What were the causes? What were the reasons given for his ultimate removal from office?
So he's removed in 1909.
At 9, okay.
But the revolution happens in 1908.
Right.
Now, the popular literature does call it a Young Turk Revolution.
Yeah.
The reason being is because it's seen as this movement by young military officers who are trying to establish a military coup to remove Abdul Hamid from power. This is interesting, though, because the Iranian Revolution, there is no young Iranian revolution. It's just called the Iranian Revolution.
Right.
The Russian Revolution is called the Russian Revolution in 1905. There is something in the way that the Ottoman Revolution is framed as a way of making the case that the revolution was inspired by Western Europe, by calling it a Young Turk Revolution. So instead of calling it like the French Revolution, they never called it the Ottoman Revolution, they called it the Young Turk Revolution. Because the narrative is that the Young Turks were inspired by the values of the French Revolution, hence they were westernizers in the vein of Western Europe. And so they moved against a religious sultan, which was Abdul Hamid II.
Yeah.
But this is a little bit of a narrow interpretation of what happened, because there were members of the ulama and so forth who were also part of this revolutionary moment.
Right.
And the reason why this was possible, perhaps, is because there were many people who were educated, who felt that they were being marginalized from the decision-making process, that they wanted to have some level of agency in the way that the state was being governed. And they were not satisfied with the direction that Abdul Hamid had taken in the latter end of his reign.
Right. Why? What was it that he had done?
Well, once again, a new group of people who are educated from the schooling system, and there is a bottleneck. I mean, there is the sense that meritocracy is not being given a chance here. Instead, loyalty to the Sultan is what's being given precedence. So there's a particular level of patronage system that Abdul Hamid executed perfectly to his advantage. And so that feeling of meritocracy is one. Second thing is there's a belief amongst a particular group of military soldiers in particular that Abdul Hamid has strayed away from the ideas of expansionism and has become quite static of just maintaining the status quo. Now, they didn't have an intention of expansionism in the way that we understand it. They just wanted to return the territories of the Ottoman Empire that had been lost back to their domains. And so they felt that a different type of strategy needed to be used. There were those who didn't know anyone else but Abdul Hamid II. He was in power for 30 years. And they'd become like exhausted by this sort of like continuum of the same old. And Abdul Hamid had a particular spy network that he used to gather information. Initially, the spy network was designed to just gather information. Like, what's happening in Yemen? Tell me, right? Reports are being sent. But this became a beast in of itself, where people were making money from attaining information to the point that there was levels of corruption that went beyond the Sultan himself now. And that antagonized a lot of people in the Ottoman domains and so on. And so there is this belief that there needs to be some sort of renewal, perhaps, in that sense. Now, there is a Muslim belief that there was some sort of Zionist intervention here. Now, most Ottoman historians don't lean in that direction. They do believe this was internal in that sense. But it's important to put that out there.
Do you think the Zionists did have a part to play in his removal?
Personally, I'm not convinced by that. I think, for me, it was a bit more detrimental that it was done internally. The revolutionary movement is a wide umbrella, and it had multiple people and agents as a part of it who had their own vested interests in what they wanted from the empire. And so one of the interesting things about, I guess, these types of revolutionary movements is people are not too sure on what they want, but they kind of pull together what they don't want. And although the constitution was used as the sort of like rhetorical device to remove Abdul Hamid from power, fundamentally, I think a large group of Ottoman elites fundamentally wanted him gone. And for us, that can be shocking looking back now. But when you're part of a political structure, Abdul Hamid's a regular human being to them. He's not seen in the same way that we are imagining it in that sense. And so they just see him as another agent who's an executive authority. And
And also, Yakoob, I understand that the ulama scholars, many of them were responsible for, or some of them were responsible for the removal of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Like, what lay behind that?
Yeah, I mean, so they're not a homogenous bloc. There were those who were heavily supportive of him, but then there is a group which you can say today are venerated within the scholarly class amongst Muslims, who were very critical of Abdul Hamid II. And they were critical in regards to his policies. And this is interesting because I think what we learn from just the human behavior is that as a person who's in a position of authority and power, there's always going to be those who are going to be critical of that, irrespective of whether it's you being a manager at a local supermarket or somebody who's running the empire or a nation. And for some members of the ulama, like Mustafa Sabri Effendi, Al-Malal Hamdi Yazar and so forth, Ahmed Akif. And for anyone who's interested, I mean, you can look at the works of Ismail Kara, a Turkish academic, but he's written very extensively on this. They were of the inclination that they wanted to move away from a charismatic leadership model and place the charisma into the state structure.
Right.
So for them, and this goes back to where we started, right? Is that Muslims are captivated by charisma, charismatic speakers, charismatic leadership, and so forth. And Abdul Hamid wasn't charismatic because he had a particular oratory style or something. He was charismatic in the sense that he was an enigma. He was invisible. People never saw him. And that created a particular mystique around him. But they saw his policies. They saw the Hijaz Railway station. They saw pictures of previous sultans being replaced by the name of Allah and Muhammad Rasulullah in Arabic and so forth. They saw Abdul Hamid's policies were deliberately outwardly projecting Islamic symbolism as a way of continuously maintaining a reverence and remembrance of Islam for the mass. And so he had that type of charisma. And that goes back to Mamdouh Pasha, as I said before, his sort of like trusted aide who believed that it should be invested in a person. Now, people like Mustafa Sabri believed that it should be in the hands of the law, the Sharia, the constitution.
Right.
They believed that nobody should be above that.
Yeah.
And that to create a system, a political structure in which the Sharia is supreme, meant that it doesn't matter who's in power, so long as the machinery safeguards itself.
Right.
And this is really interesting because we saw these types of conversations in the United States of America more recently in regards to Biden, in terms of who was actually running that state, right? What was it, the president, or was it a particular infrastructure machinery and kitchen cabinet and so forth, right? And so I'm not saying that the ulama were trying to reduce the agency of the Khalifa. I think what they were trying to do was pronounce more clearly the supremacy of the Sharia. That's what their thing was. And their concern was, I guess, that the revolutionary actors who had moved towards removing Sultan Abdul Hamid could potentially create a different type of political structure that was ignorant of the supremacy of the Sharia in that sense. And so, like I said, the revolution is made up of multiple actors who have different inclinations of what they want to see in regards to the revolution movement. And I think for Sabri in particular and Al-Malal Hamdi Yazar, you can clearly see that this is what they're trying to visualize.
Okay. Yet 15 years after his removal, the empire collapses.
Absolutely.
And, the Ottoman Sultanate, the Caliphate, is no longer in control, in power. And you have these states that are established nation states, and Turkey is just one of those nation states. And then we have the sort of the rowing back, I suppose, of Islam in Turkey, and the rest is history. Now, we've had this conversation before, but I think it's worth talking about it at this stage. The common view of Ottoman decline is that Abdul Hamid II presided over this decline. He failed to prevent it. He failed to slow it down. And in a sense, he may have aided that decline by his authoritarianism. And so that decline, which was set many, many decades, if not a century prior, that decline took its full course. And the Ottomans, in 1924, they collapsed. Is that, I know you contest that, you argue that that's not the case. So just explain that argument to us, please.
To be honest with you, I just don't care anymore. This is going to sound really harsh to some of your viewers.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's frustrated me about these podcasts that I do is there is an entitlement amongst Muslims to give them what they want because they asked. And if history is an interpretive field, from my interpretation, I'm not inclined to thinking of the narrative that you've put forward.
Right.
From my studies and years of research of looking at the sources and so forth, and workshops and conferences and arguing with other Ottoman historians, and I'm not the only one who holds this position, by the way. There's a large corpus of us, contrary to what some people on YouTube might think because they don't see us on the internet.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced by that position. Now, if people want to hold that position because they are Wikipedia historians, good for them. But I think what I'm trying to do as a historian is not obsess about the mistakes of the Ottomans.
Yeah.
That's all out there. It's easy. It's low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
The question is that where did they succeed? What did they do well? Like, what value add can I bring to the table? The other debate we can have till the cows come home over the dinner table, just like people do when they talk about football matches. It's irrelevant. How can Ottoman studies be, how can it resonate with you in terms of giving you some level of meaning?
Yeah.
If you want to believe that Abdul Hamid was an authoritarian who maintained a particular level of, despotic policies that led fundamentally to the decline of the empire, go with it. Whatever makes you happy. You do you. For me, what's interesting is when we look at World War I, the reason why Muslims around the world are still pulling together for the Ottoman Empire, it's not because of Mehmed Rashad. It's not because of the Young Turks. It's because of the policies of Abdul Hamid. That Abdul Hamid II had managed to, with his policies globally, invest in the Muslims in a way that they felt invested in moving for that empire, like the Caliphate Committee in India. Kalam Azad, Muhammad Kalam Azad, the Johar brothers, Muhammad Iqbal. Why are these people, these are intelligent people, why are they moving for the Ottoman Empire? It's because prior to that, there was a sultan who invested in a particular form of policies that had centralized this idea that the Caliphate of the Ottoman Empire was important. That resonates with us even today. That means to some degree, he's been successful. He couldn't save the empire, but he saved an idea.
Yeah.
He saved an idea. All of those who are now moving towards particular forms of revivalism, they have a huge debt to pay to Abdul Hamid II. And that can't be denied. So my frustration, I guess, and I'm not hiding that, is it's very easy to be flippant in our critique about a group of people who I've invested in deeply, who made very human decisions and made human mistakes. But I gave it a go. But today, I don't think any of us have a leg to stand on post-Gaza to look at Abdul Hamid II in the eyes and say, hey, you know what? I don't think any of us do. And that's what, I guess, as a historian has made me exhausted, which is that if we're going to do history, if we're going to do Ottoman history, we're going to speak about Abdul Hamid II, what's the point? History is an intellectual endeavor that is supposed to help us reimagine ourselves and trying to find solutions to our current predicament. And the way you do that is you take the whole package, both good and bad, and say, okay, this is where they succeeded, this is where they failed. I've said to you before that I disagree with the spy network of Abdul Hamid II. I think that perhaps, him being in power for too long was problematic.
Yeah.
But his works on the Hijaz Railway station can't be denied.
Yeah.
His ideas on bringing a sense of pride back in the minds of the Muslims at a time where there was a belief that the Muslim world was crumbling under their feet was important. I think the hardest thing to give anyone, and I think this is where the Ottomans and the Hamidian state managed to do that, was to give the Muslims at that time a level of hope. And hope is hard, especially when everything's crumbling around you and you're making particular levels of appeals and no one's moving for that. To still give hope is important. And they were not just rhetorically given hope. They were resistant. They were the only Muslim entity that resisted Western colonialism to the point of combustion. And I think that that is something that Abdul Hamid should take a lot of credit for. The empire didn't collapse on his watch. It collapsed on the watch of the Young Turks. And that is their legacy.
Dr. Yakoob Ahmed, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today. Jazakallah khair. Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels and head over to our website thinkinmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.